You're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Welcome to the TeachThought podcast. Terry, introduce yourself.
My name is Terry Ike. I'm a former classroom teacher and now director at TeachThought, which means I do a lot of different things very badly.
And I'm Drew Perkins. I'm the director of professional development here at TeachThought, and hopefully that means I do a lot of different things really well.
And together we're hosting a podcast, which hopefully makes TeachThought more accessible to you in more places, right, Drew?
Well, hopefully, yeah, but mostly it's just me hosting it because you just add episodes every so often, right?
Well, I've got things to do. Remember, I'm director.
That's true. Thank you again for tuning into the podcast. My name is Drew Perkins. I'm the director of TeachThought Professional Development, and as usual, I'd like to remind folks that they can find more information about our work and our services with schools around the world, workshops that we offer, blogs, podcasts, and of course our summer TeachThought PBL Grow 18 event in Louisville, Kentucky. We're excited to offer that again this year with folks from around the world. So seats are filling up. It is July 9th through 12th, and you can find all the information at wegrowteachers.com/grow18. In this podcast, I spoke with Carole Basile, who is a dean and professor of the Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, and they're doing some really interesting and innovative work in the teacher prep areas. We discussed lots of the sort of why, what, and how they are working on changing the teacher prep work that they do, and explored some of the questions like why that change is needed, how they prepared their pre-service students to work collaboratively and change that system from within, what she calls an entrepreneur, and how we can improve the quality of existing teachers and the teaching workforce and some of those issues around the complexity of those problems, some of the obstacles that they are facing and how they might overcome those internally and externally, as well as even some suggestions and thinking around professional development and perhaps some of those shifts that might be made. So, intriguing conversation, and I sure hope that we see more of this in teacher pre-service programs around the country. I hope you enjoy the podcast, and here, without any further ado, is Carole Basile. All right, welcome. I have with me Carole Basile, who is calling in, I assume, from Arizona, because she is the dean and professor of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University, and I'm really curious and excited to talk with her about the work that they're doing in the teacher prep arena and area, and something that I think is direly needed as a former teacher and having gone through teacher prep many years ago and working with lots of teachers who have recently gone through teacher prep. It always amazes me the work that is being done in lots of teacher prep programs seems to be really, really dated. So, Carole, welcome to the podcast. I'll give you an opportunity to introduce yourself before we get going.
Thanks, Drew. So I have been at Arizona State University about a year and a half, a little bit more than that now. And before this was the dean at the University of Missouri, St. Louis, had been at the University of Colorado, Denver before that, University of Houston. So have spent some time around the country in education for a long time. Research areas have primarily been in the area of teacher preparation, teacher education, and actually have about a 15-year business career prior to coming back into education. And so this has been an exciting time for us to begin thinking really differently about what teacher preparation and teacher education and the role of a college of education can be.
Okay, and how, just so we can get a little bit of a context here, how long have you been at ASU?
It'll be 2 years in August.
2 years, okay, so that'll give us a little bit of an idea of, as I would imagine you're working to make some pretty substantive changes, perhaps. I don't know how much how much of the shift is necessary based on what was going on before you arrived, but 2 years is a pretty short amount of time. So let's just kind of start our conversation about why. So as you work in this area of teacher preparation, why do we need to make a shift? And then we'll kind of talk about some of the what's and the how you're doing it.
Sure. So we talk about really that there are three imperatives for our work. One is an economic imperative that we believe today, as we look at what's happening, how the workforce is changing, how the world is changing, the exponential growth in knowledge, that in order to prepare students, young kids, for the next generation of whatever the world is going to be, whatever the jobs are going to be, that we're going to need a very different kind of education workforce. And so we take this on really as an economic imperative to make sure that kids are able to actually get what they need for the big W workforce as they move forward, because we think that's an economic imperative. We also think there's an equity imperative. We still see issues around achievement gap. We still know that we have equity issues in schools today. So we also believe that there is an equity imperative to this. And the last one then is our democracy and our citizenship, as we think about what does it mean to actually educate students today and create a workforce that can prepare those students to live as citizens in a democracy.
So is all of those things kind of, to me, in my mind, I'm not hearing education teacher specific as much as just an overview. And I know we have a podcast episode talking about your virtual learning opportunities with high schools, which is not teacher prep, and some of that same language. So is this an overall ASU kind of mission, or is it more specific to the Teachers College?
Well, I think it's overall, but it is also specific to the Teachers College, and I think it should be specific really to all colleges of education who have the responsibility of preparing the next generation of educators who are going to prepare the next generation of kids for a very different world. And so I think that the way that we think about this from a college of education perspective and a teacher education perspective then is that we look at the job of a teacher today and basically say it is given all of that, given where we think kids need to go, that the job of a teacher as it is created today in a single classroom and single teachers and single classrooms for the most part, that it is an untenable position today, that it is inflexible, that it is isolating, and clearly we have issues around workforce shortage, we have issues around retention of teachers. So I think that all of that is all symptomatic of some other things that are going on, and actually symptomatic of the way that the world is changing, and that these imperatives of the economy and equity and democracy are part and parcel of the need for wanting to change what we think of as the education workforce. And so today, what teacher preparation does is we prepare widget teachers. We, for the most part, have teachers who come through our program. The states tell us what the standards are. They all have to take certain numbers of credits or meet certain numbers of standards. And in the state of Arizona, that's about 174 competencies, in addition to all of the other content that they need to know, and all the people who, frankly, are lined up around my door who think there's a whole lot of other things that teachers should know and be able to do.
As you're talking about that shift with teachers, that's a very similar shift that we often talk about with students. So, I mean, what are the differences in, or if there are differences in, how we need to prepare our teachers and how we need to prepare our students?
Well, I think, Drew, right now that, we're preparing teachers for a model of schooling that is a one teacher, one classroom model. And we expect that every single teacher is going to know everything the collective we knows when they walk into a group of 30 kids who all have this, different needs and different backgrounds and in different situations in their life at any given moment. And I think that model is not the right model to be preparing them for anymore. I think that given what we know about technology, where we're moving with technology, the thinking around personalized learning, how we begin to think differently for different contexts, in community contexts, whether that be rural or tribal or urban kinds of contexts. I think that the preparation of teachers needs to change dramatically. And I think to the point where what we are thinking about is actually creating and reimagining the entire education workforce. So when I say that, that means that we're not creating these widget teachers, but that the novice teachers that we actually prepare become only one piece of the overall puzzle of thinking about who educators are and how we, instead of saying, here's the group of kids, and then saying to a group of adults, here's your 30 kids, your 30 kids, your 30 kids, we want to say, look, here's all the kids, and flip this and say, who are the adults that these kids need, and what is the knowledge that they need as a collective, and how do we build a collective group of adults around these kids in order to make sure that they get what they get when they need it. And so we're beginning to think very differently about how we actually build what we're calling communities of educators, where our students are a piece of that. They are the sort of novice teachers that we're preparing, but even before they enter the classroom as that first year teacher, they also are seen as part of an early workforce where they can now be paid, be put on teams, can begin to work with kids even in their sophomore, junior, senior year, and that we begin to shift and leverage what we do as a teacher preparation program to begin to change that one teacher, one classroom model. And in addition to that, we also want to prepare master teachers who are out there now to become what we would call managing teachers or orchestrating teachers, who can work with teams, who can look at data, who can triage kids, who can make sure they're getting who they need, plus develop a community of educators who may also come in and begin to fill certain kinds of roles, and then think differently about what's leadership begins to look like. So it's really a fundamental shift of thinking about who the educator is, what they do, who all these people are. It's not unlike nursing in some ways, where we used to have LPNs and RNs, and now we have medical assistants, and you have volunteers, but you have medical assistants, you have community health workers, you have LPNs, you have RNs now with bachelor's degrees, you have physician's assistants, you have nurse practitioners, and you have a whole lot of specialists. And those people are all working in teams around groups of patients.
That's an interesting analogy, and thinking back on my teacher prep experience, and again the work that we do with teachers and I think that I was lucky enough that when I went back to get a teaching certificate, I was a bit older. I had an undergraduate degree, and then engaged in some work in the business place, and then decided to go back and get my teaching certificate, and was at that point doing some substitute teaching. And while it's, I'm sure not quite the same dynamic that you're sort of talking about with sophomores and juniors engaging with students and actually working in schools, it did at least allow me to engage with the education system in a number of different ways and understand it a little bit differently and contextualize that in the classwork, and at the very least gave me an idea of what I was getting myself into instead of getting to the end. One of the things that you mentioned is the idea of, or that dynamic of the achievement gap, and I'm wondering how you define that, because I honestly I bristle a little bit at that achievement gap language and that sort of culture of achievement versus a culture of teaching and learning, and I'm wondering how you define that and how you see that playing out, because certainly it's an issue, but one of the things that I sort of bristle about that word achievement is that it's so often seems to lead to such a focus. I'm actually having a conversation have been in the last 12 hours or so with another podcast guest, somebody here, a Western Kentucky University professor, and he's been on the podcast before, about that culture of achievement versus culture of teaching and learning. So is there a difference in those two things to you, or how does that play out in your work?
Well, I guess I think about achievement pretty broadly. I think it's whether or not you think about achievement in terms of testing, or you think about achievement in a much more broad perspective in terms of, we also achieve things like citizenship and, a broader sense of being able to become lifelong learners and be successful and, again, be part of an economic ecosystem and just be able to, participate in society in a way that, that is equitable. Because I think there are a tremendous number of kids who come into the system. I mean, I think about my kids, for example, right, who came into the system, and the system could work, it could work okay for my kids, but that's because, my kids were able to get a whole lot of other things, right? I mean, they were traveling, they had, whatever they needed. If they needed tutors, if they needed, they had coaches, they had doctors, they had lots of people, lots of adults collectively around them, because we had the wherewithal to be able to do that and the network to be able to do that. And a lot of kids don't, right? So I think there is an equity issue here. Whether we call it achievement gap or not, I think it's all how you define what that is.
Sure.
I think there's been probably a traditional definition of it, but for me, again, I think that's just an example of a piece of this equity issue of being able to say that if we keep thinking that every kid needs one teacher per year, and that one teacher is going to be the end all be all for that kid and for every kid that teacher has, I think that's where it's problematic. And I think that's why we have to start thinking about a collective of educators, because most of us who can do that anyway for our kids. But I think there is a greater need to be thinking about this in a very different way.
Yeah, the equity issue, as I think about that, and we've been really working to expand and grow that work in TeachThought PD work that we do, because it is a real issue, and as you mentioned, it's sort of how you operationalize that word achievement and what that means, and sort of the outcomes, the things that happen because of the focus. And for me, I really am more concerned with the thinking than the scores and the content. And I feel like the traditional teacher prep and the traditional sort of education policy is to take that low-hanging fruit and really focus on the scores and the proficiencies, where I think the actual real mileage that we can get out of teaching and learning is focusing on the thinking and the contextualizing and the excitement and the curiosity, and those other things come along. As you think about equity, what other pieces define that? Is it equity of opportunity, equity of outcome, giving
all of the above, right? I mean, it's all of the above, and I think what you see is people trying to figure out how to measure it, and I think the achievement piece, right, ends up being it's an ends to the means here. But I think because that's what you have, or that's how we've defined it. I mean, we're having conversation right now about, if you have a collective of educators, so if instead of 2 days before school starts, every parent, instead of finding out who my kid's teacher is going to be, and the reactions to finding out who your kid's teacher is going to be, right? I mean, it's either, yay, I got the great teacher, or, I got the new teacher, or, ugh, right? And the only reason I know that is whether or not my neighbors told me. The difference between that and actually knowing whether or not I have the right teacher for my kid, or the right teachers, right? So now, what if 2 days before school starts, I get to go find out who the team of educators are for my kid? There's a big difference there, and there is a chance I think a better chance that that team is going to be able to serve my child's needs in a way that I think is more equitable. Because now there's just more people with more eyes and more opportunity to build relationships and to think about the interests that my child has and how to connect my child to the kind of learning and teaching, teaching and learning that you're talking about, which I totally wholeheartedly agree with.
Sure.
But I think that's the difference, right? So that, you have teachers then who are less stressed, who are able then to specialize, who are able to focus, who are working with a team of other adults who actually get an opportunity to talk to other adults, go to the bathroom. We've got to reduce the stress on educators. I mean, the health data that's coming out right now about it on educators is finally we're talking about this, because that's from my perspective as somebody who's in teacher preparation, that at the heart of it is, how are we preparing educators? Who are the educators? And what do they do when they get out there? And so if I'm preparing, 1,000 graduates every year and they're walking into the field, but they don't stay in the field, then that's a problem I also should be dealing with. And that's a responsibility I have as a dean of a college of education to say, okay, what can we be doing that looks different and allows us to change the system in some really fundamental ways, because we have to today. This one teacher, one classroom model, it just isn't going to work. Not going to continue to work. Not as the amount of knowledge in our society continues to grow exponentially.
Yeah, that point is interesting in a number of ways, but as you mentioned, the stress and the difficulties and the burnout of being a teacher, I was reminded of just the difficulties of being a teacher. I was helping my 5th grade daughter's classroom, and a brand new teacher who is fearless and has lots of work to do on improving her craft, as we all do, but I enjoyed that process. But just the days that I was in the class working with those 5th grade students and her, it was a stark reminder of how frenetic and how difficult that is, and that's at a school that the stress is certainly not as high. So part of that is, and I'm wondering as we sort of move to the what that you do in your programs, and partly as the how, the what and the how are very closely related, but what are the structures and the things that you've done inside your programs that not only allow for those teams of teachers, because it's not just a team of teachers, it's a highly functional quality team of teachers, I'm thinking, right? So what are some of the things that you do internally, and how do you prepare? Because most of the time, unfortunately, they're not going to go into a school that way. And the other dynamic that really I think is very important here is, how do you prepare them perhaps in a way to affect change? Because at some point there'll be a beginning teacher, a more experienced teacher, and perhaps move into leadership. And I say leadership as far as not being a teacher in the classroom, and certainly there needs to be and should be some blurring of the lines there. But you can very easily be labeled. I certainly felt this way in some of the schools in which I worked, and that when I asked questions and when I tried to push that envelope towards a better, more collaborative environment and ask some really hard questions, you can really get blacklisted and sort of marginalized. So what are some of those things you do internally to prepare teachers to work together, but also to push and question that system towards the change we need?
Mm-hmm. So let me be very clear that we're at the nascent stage of all of this. Again, I've been here a year and a half. But I'm putting a team in place here and making some changes. But we also have, sitting at the table with us, are probably 15 to 20 and the list is growing, schools and school districts, so whether it's charter school leaders or traditional public school superintendents and leaders sitting at the table with us trying to figure this out, what we're finding, right, is that as we're shifting our program and thinking about what it means for our program, but also how do we create all kinds of other credentialing mechanisms for people in communities to also be part of this and become some type of educator on the continuum. There's a fundamental change there, and then there's a fundamental change around getting in and beginning to change what has been, I think, a pretty I don't even know the right word just to even describe professional development. But it's always in education been a push in. Like this has always been, we're going to do professional development for teachers because we know better and we know what they need. And professional development that is what I always call like supply side. So this is, reform coming from the outside. It's professional development coming from the outside, pushing in. We believe that teachers and with the community need to begin to think about the systems within the organization and begin to figure out how to work and design teams to also change those systems. So we're beginning to put these design teams in place so that we know we can't create a new workforce if we don't redesign what's happening in schools. And we want to make sure that our students are working in schools where some of this design work is happening and where there is an openness to it. We actually talk a lot about preparing what we would call entrepreneurial teachers or educators. These are people who can ask the right questions, who know how to navigate uncertainty, who know how to work in teams. And so we're trying to create the context for that and working with school partners on both sides of this. So we have people who are really dabbling in this work right now. They've thought about different roles that they would like people to play in their communities, and this, depending on their context, is actually emerging in some very interesting and very different ways. So as we think about where we place our teacher candidates, we're talking to these districts and saying, this is what it's going to require. We have 2 districts now that have embarked on actually hiring some of our teacher candidates in their junior, senior year. As we're starting this program, we're in the process of trying to rethink about content, get out of 3 credit hour courses, develop content that is usable and relevant to our teacher candidates when they're in schools and in these roles in their jobs, so that they're getting what they need when they need it. So it is also a more personalized approach to thinking about teacher preparation. But the schools that are hiring them are thinking, they're putting them on teams, they're giving them different roles to play in these schools. So we have at least 2 districts now that are thinking about getting out of this sort of, we're putting them with one mentor teacher or the residency program, which we've had for a long time. We're moving away from that. It has not been good for our students. So, there are other districts that we're working with in rural. We now have a K-12 digital platform here at ASU. And we're working with them on creating what we're calling a facilitator role, because we understand that, we will never have enough physics teachers out there in rural communities. We keep trying to get more math and science teachers. I just don't think that's going to happen. We have the similar issues around tribal. So if we can bring in digital content, so the educator may be sitting here in Phoenix, or anywhere actually, and the content can be brought in digitally to kids, then there are other roles that people within the community can play as educators, and we're going to prepare them to know how to engage kids. We're going to prepare them to really focus on the socio-emotional side of what's going on with kids and making sure that they're on target. So it's a role, I think, a little bit like a community health worker, but it's a community education worker, because now they don't have to know the content, but there are things that we still need in face-to-face relationships with kids.
Are there some things that those districts some changes that they're making structurally to sort of bridge that gap between what you're doing with your pre-service teachers and what they will do as teachers, some of that collaborative and team structures?
Yes, right. So it's all of that, right? And they're also then preparing, so we're creating this other credential around this managing teacher, orchestrating teacher, right? To figure out what does that look like and how does that change the role of somebody who's an educator to be able to make sure that we understand which kids need to be with what people at what time. It becomes a matrix organization, and that role I think is going to be critical. But I think that is this higher level professional role for educators that I think is also going to be very different. I think that a lot of what we're talking about is how do we continue to professionalize the profession. How do we say that, like, look, nobody walks into a school unless they've had some kind of preparation. Even if you're coming in to just read to kids, we know that there's some skill to reading to kids, and you could be more effective if you actually understood what those skills were. So we're creating different kinds of credentials for these different roles as the districts identify the kinds of roles that they think are important given their context.
You noted the professionalizing, and I'm a big fan of that as well, and have expressed some ideas around that. I'm wondering, and it's one of the questions that I'd written down as you had been talking, because it does get to that idea of professionalizing teaching, and I do think that there's a reality in so far as people can say, public school or whatever is under attack. That might be sensational. Clearly, in Arizona, you're dealing with some pay. Here in Kentucky, we're dealing with some pay issues. I mean, it's not a secret. But there's also a reality that there are schools and there are teachers who underperform. And so is there some thinking that you have, some wisdom that you have gained from your work that might help us to professionalize and basically increase the quality of the teaching and learning of existing teachers? And part of that's the PD environment and system as well. And as you're talking, it speaks to the ecosystem. But are there some things that we can do to better, or what might we do better to professionalize and increase the quality of the teaching force that's existing?
So, I always want to lean when we talk about, sort of employee issues and things like that, to give people the benefit of the doubt around,
sure,
their abilities. What I believe, though, is that, again, we are asking every single teacher, think about elementary teachers in particular, like we're asking every one of those teachers to know how to teach reading, math, science, social studies, work with kids with ELL, work with kids with special needs, and do it all extraordinarily well. And I think a couple things have happened over the years. One is the amount of knowledge that we're asking them to impart to kids earlier, right, has grown. The amount of knowledge itself has grown. But I think the other thing that has also changed over time that we do not recognize is that the practice itself and what we know about practice, about teaching and learning itself, has also become much more complex. And so we're also asking people to know all that content and be able to teach it in all of these differently complex ways. So people are not able to specialize, right? Like we say, okay, there are people who are really, really good at teaching reading, but may not be as good at teaching math, or may not be as good as teaching science, or may not be as good as, whatever. But I think the opportunity here, when you start to put people on teams and you start to distribute expertise, is that now you have an opportunity for people to actually get good at what they're good at. There is no other organization, and as you know, Drew, if you worked in business, this organizations in anywhere, I don't care if it's nonprofits, I don't care if it's business, there's no other organization that actually functions like this, hires people who do everything. I say to business people all the time, this is like saying, here's a group of clients, and you have to be the accountant and the technology person and the manager and the salesperson, and like you have to be everything for that group of clients. It just doesn't make sense, and yet that's what we're doing in education today. And so I often wonder whether or not, if we can think about this in a more distributed way, that people could actually utilize their expertise and their passion and their interests around what they can do. I mean, they came into education because they wanted to work with kids, they wanted to do this work, I hope. But the expectations have become so great that I think there's a piece of this that there are people who cannot do it all. There are some fabulous people out there who can do it all, and those people should be rewarded, and those people should actually be in different positions. They should be these orchestrating teachers. They should be the people who we're thinking about as these master teachers who then make more money, who have a different role to play. But the sort of, the people who are just want to be a good teacher of something should also be allowed to do that. And so I don't know that we know, right, who the good teachers are and the bad teachers are, because the bar is so high today in terms of just the amount of knowledge and the complexity of practice that we're asking people to know. I don't know if that's fair.
Yeah.
So I think it's hard to tell. And I think until you start to evaluate based on something else and their ability to work in a team and their ability to, then there's a whole set of other skills, right, that you have to prepare for, but now you're also evaluating for in a different way. It's a different look, I think.
Yeah, I think the sort of the thinking around teacher evaluations and what that looks like, again, it's such a complex, nuanced issue. But as you mentioned in talking about sort of thinking and working as teams, that as you mentioned, I really do believe and have seen evidence of in the work that we do with teachers that almost to a T, teachers are passionate about their work. They want to get better, but it's really hard to get better because what better is supposed to look like and be constantly changes depending upon, it's sort of short-sighted, looks different because the next shiny thing and the next thing to check off in your binder comes along, but and the complexity of what we say is the modern world makes that more difficult. But it really when it comes to professional dialogue and really teachers having that professional dialogue around the quality of the work as teams, I imagine the teams that you're talking about would have, that's what we see in our professional development, that the rewards of that, the elation of the teachers who are passionate about their work, and to me that's a way, and one of perhaps the best ways to improve the quality of the teaching and learning in a school, is that you use a great lens for quality and then have professional dialogue around all of the work that you're doing. And in my mind, if you focused on that with teachers, if teachers were focusing on that in critiquing and having great conversation around the quality of each other's work, not in an evaluative way as we traditionally think about it, because that can feel threatening, and that's a culture piece, that the outcomes that the students would be engaged in would be tremendously improved. And that's a game changer, and it makes me wonder. I was having this conversation, somebody asked me, what are some of the policy recommendations that you would have for I guess at state level, and are there things that you would like to see pushed and changed? And I can't imagine there aren't. What are some of those things?
Yeah, a lot of people ask me that too, and I think it's going to be probably state-based, right? This is, it depends on where you are. In Arizona, for me, one, it's the definition of a teacher, because they actually define it here pretty narrowly. And the other is probably the definition of seat time for kids. But I think in different places, it's going to be different. There will be different policy issues. I also believe that there are a lot of things that don't happen, not because of policy, that it's, Rick Hess wrote a book, Cage Busting Leadership, and we talk a lot about this notion of cage busting, that so much of what we do is because we've put the constraints around it ourselves. It's like internal policy, but it's not real. Or they are things that we could change if we have the will to do it. And I think we have to look at some of that first. And I think that's what the superintendents here are really taking a look at and saying, look, is that true? Like, we've always thought X, but is that really true? And who told us that? And did we hear it from somebody at the Department of Education years ago? And we've just always taken that as gospel, but it's not statute. It's not a law, right?
Right.
But it's just something we've always done. And I think that's those are the sort of questions that we have to begin to ask, is whether or not it's really policy, or whether or not it's just things that, that we've just always done it that way, and we don't question it. And so we're doing that a lot here when we talk about, we're going to get out of 3 credit hour classes. Like, there's nothing here that doesn't allow us to do that. There's nothing here that doesn't allow us to extend semesters or, work within defined timeframes. That's the way that we have just defined our work. And so at ASU, at least, we have leadership that's going to allow us to do that. And I think schools also have to ask those questions, and we have to find those places where we have leaders. I always talk about the speed of the leader, but where the leadership, which is going to be really critical in all of this, is willing to allow educators to do some things differently, where they can figure out a budget in a different way, because a lot of people will say, oh my gosh, this sounds really expensive, when in fact we have superintendents that are figuring this out within the current budgetary structure. And believe me, if the superintendents here can do it within their budgets, given the issues here around funding, others could figure this out. So I think I think those are the things. I think it's going to be imperative for folks that are part of unions to start thinking about some of this. I think it would actually be better for their membership to start thinking in some of these ways and reimagining what this workforce could look like, and how do you begin to deconstruct almost the job of an educator. But it's deconstruct. What did somebody told me last night? Unburden teachers. But it is this sort of deconstructed in order to construct the entire workforce of education in a very different way.
So let me ask you this question. You've mentioned a couple times, and this may be, clearly is a sensitive issue in lots of ways, and unions being a part of that, is some of the financial parts. So with budgets of schools or any of the budgets around any of the pieces of the ecosystem, K-12, university level, and or the pay of teachers. Some people certainly say teachers are overpaid. Lots of people say teachers are underpaid. I would agree personally with both of those. Some teachers are underpaid, and lots of them, but there are some teachers that underperform, and this would be a small minority who are probably overpaid because of the work and the quality of work they do. So should we be paying teachers more? Do schools need and should they have more money?
Well, look, $30,000 starting salary is not a living wage to begin with. And so I think that's, it's going to be incumbent on districts to figure some of this out. This is a workplace issue in every single workplace. This is not just an education issue when you talk about how to give merit increases and raises and all of those kinds of things based on what you hope is merit and performance. And so, what I'm suggesting is that maybe the old ways of thinking about this in terms of a one teacher, one classroom model may not be the right way as we move forward. I think this is, the pay raises we're talking about here are, I think, nominal when you think about 20% over 3 years, if that happens. But I think it will be left to school districts to figure out how to, how to then parse those dollars out and how to think about what evaluation really looks like. And are there some new things? Are there new expectations around working in teams and being able to be innovative, not just in a classroom, but in terms of systems change that become part of an evaluation process that just haven't been there before? New expectations around some of this that also would have to change.
Yeah, and so I think to your point of the unions perhaps rethinking, and I don't want to speak for all unions because I certainly don't know the mission of all unions, but as sort of a generic mission is certainly to advocate for teachers, and that's an important mission. But how do we do that and balance that in a way that improves the quality of teaching and learning, which actually is an advocacy piece for teachers, but certainly it's a complex issue. I don't want to go down that road for this podcast. So you mentioned some of the pieces that we've always done it this way, that kind of thing. I'm wondering what kind of obstacles internally you've encountered in the 2 years that you've been embarking on this work. And I can imagine, when we work with teachers, when we work with students, I remember as a teacher working with students and trying to do a different kind of learning, and you certainly get pushback from them. So what about your professors and your internal structures? What are the obstacles, and how have you been able to, or perceive being able to get past some of those obstacles?
I actually think people here have been actually pretty excited about the ideas. I mean, I'm sure it's not everybody, but I think certainly enough people here are on board. They're willing to take the time. They're willing to think about some of this with us. They recognize that, change needs to happen, that we need to think about, that we need to move. As I said when I came in the door, that we've got to move from thinking about programs and projects and activities to systems change. And how we do that as a collective. I think people have gotten on board. I have to say there hasn't been a lot of pushback around it. I think we've been trying to listen to lots of people's ideas about this. And I would say some of this is not new. I mean, some of these ideas are certainly not new. Somebody handed me a book the other day and said, it's called Differentiated Staffing. And a lot of these ideas are in there. And then I have to tell you, Drew, when I opened up the book, there was a library card in the book. The book was written in 1972, right, by a professor who's now at UNC Chapel Hill. And there was a superintendent here who had written a chapter in that book with Mesa Public Schools where they were trying some of this, right, in the 70s. I mean, we had open classrooms. We tried all of that. And I think times have changed. I think those were always good ideas. I think they were always the right ideas. I think, it's all about timing for ideas. I think we have technology today that is going to allow us and that is pushing us towards fundamental change, where kids can get things today and they're learning in different ways today because they have more access to things online. We see kids joining affinity groups. We're seeing people who are now making a living coaching gaming, right? I was on the other day and, we're seeing people who are taking on these educator roles, and they're making $15 to $50 an hour coaching individuals and teams of kids, right, on various video games. Mm-hmm. And so I think this notion that there are going to be different educator roles because kids are going to have these interests and want to reach out and want to have access to people who have different knowledge sets, that kids aren't going to all walk out with this common knowledge set because that's just not who they are, and they think about things in different ways. I'm living vicariously through my son, who's a sophomore here, who's, I think he's changed his major 4 times, and last night again said, I think I'm not going to do this minor. I think I'm going to take this class because he met somebody, or he was exposed to something, or he saw something on the internet, or, who knows, right? Like where this is coming from. But, and he says, and I just watched this YouTube video for an hour of, looking at business intelligence, and I think it's really fascinating. So I decided to drop this minor, and I'm going to go do this. And that's what happens. The kids are getting this sort of information so quickly, but it's piquing their interests, and you want them to follow their interests. And I think then it's going to take a very different education community that allows them, or educator community, right, that allows them to do that and doesn't keep pushing them back and going, no, you can't have interest in that, you have to stay in this box, but allows them to actually be able to get out of that box, to be able to follow their interests, to be able to be curious, to be able to, all the things that you're talking about, and set them up for, to be lifelong learners. We're not going to teach them everything they need to know in 12 years or 16 years or, whatever the box is we want. It just isn't going to happen that way anymore. And they're just learning in such different ways. And so I believe that today we have to think about who the educators are, how they function, how they work, what they do, who they are, how do we engage communities. We have a district here who's wanting to create a role called a project-based mentor, a problem-based mentor, with corporations here, with companies who already have employees, right, who are working in schools and doing things, but typically they're coming in and, they do I'm a guest speaker for 30 minutes, or, they're painting walls, or they're building playgrounds, or, but what they really need to do is be expert givers. They need to be able to, they can get online, they can get on Skype or Zoom or whatever, and talk to kids and, present problems to kids and provide their expertise around what they do in their business and the problems that are actually happening in their communities, and stick with kids for a period of time to help work through these kinds of problems with them. But we could never expect teachers to be able to do that because they don't have the experience to do it.
Yeah.
Right? And even if you're a career-changing person like you still only have the experience that you have, let alone my 21 or 22-year-olds, right, that are graduating, and we're saying, yes, go out there and be relevant and, teach them the world and show them what's going on. And you're going, relevant to what?
Right. Well, relevant to what, and we bring that down to the work that students are doing in K-12 classes and asking them to read things and do things and work on problems, and it's not relevant to them or interesting or contextualized. Right. And you say, well, wonder why our reading scores aren't better. Well, because you're asking them to read things that they don't care about is probably part of that. And, I never wanted to be a teacher. I actually came from a line of teachers. My grandmother was a teacher. My mother was a teacher, and I knew better, but then it speak to that passion. It really draws you back in. And talking about the money, and I know you went to Penn State, and so perhaps this will ring some bells for you, but my grandmother in 1933-34 was a teacher in Erie, Pennsylvania, and while I would agree with you $30,000 is not a living wage, she made $960. I have her contract in my office here, so $960 a year. So maybe things have gotten a little bit better. Of course, that's adjusted for inflation and all that. But
I also talked to somebody yesterday who said that they taught in the 80s, late 80s, and their starting salary was $28,000.
Yeah.
And so it hasn't gone up very much.
No, and that's true.
I mean, that's the problem. It just is still, it's not enough. It's not enough when you start having kids and you start to see teachers that have multiple jobs and, and have kids and all of that, and they can't do it. And then you wonder why performance is down, right? So there's all those kinds of things too that I think that this working conditions piece in some ways I think is even more critical or as critical as the funding piece and the salary piece.
Yeah.
But I think it is disproportionately low here. But I think, I think the job just has to change. And I think that we just need to think differently. If we were to wipe the slate clean and we were to say, look, let's actually let's build a workforce. I mean, this is a workforce development issue for me. And we were to think differently about that workforce today for where kids are coming from, the issues of equity, the issues of our economy, what we think the big W workforce is going to look like down the road. and our democracy. I think you'd build a very different teaching workforce today.
I'm sorry.
And so that's what we're embarking on here.
So, and I'm mindful of your time here. I'm wondering just a couple quick things here. If you have a brief answer, as we work in the PD space, obviously, and you mentioned doing PD, we certainly try not to come in and present ourselves as the expert, and this is exactly, but we try to take it from a different perspective. What should, I mean, you're certainly in a professional development space, but it's obviously different in context. What should PD look like, or what should it not?
I think that, the approach that we're taking is that it has to come from the inside. It can't be this sort of demand side, or I should say a supply side, like pushing it in, right? It has to be demand side. Mm-hmm. It has to be, what is it that the educators in those buildings, and probably with community members, see as the fundamental systems problems, right? I mean, whether that's bell schedules, or the way kids move through the building, or being able to figure out how you work with architects that help you to look at space differently, because people will ask me about that all the time. But can we, we're not going to tear down and rebuild all these schools, but we have folks that are tearing down walls, and we have folks that are beginning to think about the rectangles within the big rectangle, right, in some different ways. But the approach has to be a systems approach, and it has to be a working with those educators in those buildings to actually figure it out and bring in enough expertise and enough different perspective of people who understand the context to be able to fundamentally change systems. And so the PD is focused on more and more and more in terms of practice and complexity of practice. But I think it's time to also start to really look at how do we change the systems so that this practice and the complexity of practice could actually work, but that we don't just keep trying to do the same things. And I've had many National Science Foundation grants. I've had lots of opportunities, right, to do professional development with teachers. And I think today we have to have the courage to leave past successes behind. And we need to think about this in some very, very different ways, because people are leaving. And so you can do all the professional development you want, and when a third of your teachers are leaving every year, it's for naught. You just keep spinning those wheels and spending that money, and it's just not sustainable.
Right. Yeah. It's it's the same dynamic. You mentioned sort of the push and pull. That's what we try to get teachers to engage with their students in a pull, not a push. And we try to engage teachers and schools in that. But it's obviously a complex issue. Carole, I appreciate what your work is focused on, and I appreciate the time. If you have a short list of sort of characteristics and qualities that you want your graduates from your teacher's college to come out of school with, that would be great to share, as well as links and places to find you and things you're reading or anything like that.
So it's interesting. I was talking to somebody the other day, and they used this term principled innovation. And I think what we're doing is we're building our DNA in two ways. One is we want our students to come out as entrepreneurs, people within organizations who actually can enact change and push innovation, which means they've got to be able to ask the right questions. They have to be able to navigate uncertainty, and they've got to be able to work in teams to solve systems type problems. But they also have to be able to do this with character. And we're also embarking on we just got a large gift to think about what character development actually looks like in teacher preparation and leadership preparation right now. And that's how we basically develop the character of our students. But it also is pushing us to think about our context differently, and how that context also models for our students this notion of principled innovation. And so I think that's what I'm going to talk about next week at graduation. And I think that's really the important thing right now, that our students get as much experience as they can, that they are thinking differently about what schools can look like, about how they can work together and go out and start to change some of this.
Okay, great. And places where they can find you or they should navigate to on the interwebs?
Yeah, www.education.asu.edu.
Okay. Any social media outlets or anything?
Oh, there probably are. I don't know them off the top of my head. You can find us, Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College at Arizona State University.
All right, we'll make sure to look those up. And I know we've gone a little bit longer than we'd hoped, but I appreciate your thinking. And I sure wish I was able to engage in this when I was a pre-service teacher. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Carole. Mm-hmm. Bye.
That'll do it for today's podcast. Thanks so much for listening, and if you didn't hate it, please leave us a review on iTunes or wherever you're listening, and share it on social media wherever you feel comfortable. Speaking of social media, you can find us in all the normal places like Facebook, Twitter, Google+, LinkedIn, Pinterest, and please share us on those places as well. And don't forget about TeachThought Professional Development. You can find us there at teachthought.com/PD.